Good morning. My name's David Ross from AECOM. I'm going to present some of the technical details on the changes for new homes. So what we're going to try to do today is present the technical details and some of the reasoning behind the details to help you respond to the consultation. If you've got any questions at the end, please do ask. If you have any comments at the end, please do say so, and they'll be included in the consultation response analysis. So what I'm going to be talking about today is the different options for reductions in CO2 emissions, talking about the percentage improvements, which Francois has already alluded to, 40% to 25%. How should the target be expressed? Are there ways in which it can be simpler to understand and implement for Wales? And also, what do we do for off-gas grid fuels? Then we'll be talking about the energy limits, the energy demand limits, other changes to Part L for new homes, then wrapping it up with a summary at the end. So first of all, starting with the options for reductions in CO2 emissions for new homes. As Francois said, currently in Wales, you have to achieve code level 3 plus 1 additional energy credit. So what that broadly equates to is 8% carbon reduction compared to Part L 2010. That's, if you look at the English consultation, that's broadly where England's talking about going for 2013. Is about where we are in Wales at the moment. What we're talking about is for 2015 is having a target of a 40% improvement compared to 2010. So we've already in Wales gone part of the way towards it by the additional energy credit, code 3 plus additional energy credit. We're now talking about going all the way to 40%, which again is broadly equivalent to where England are thinking about for 2016 with their zero carbon homes target. The idea is to phase its introduction and not bring it in straight away, but bring it in 2015. The alternative option is a 25% improvement, which is broadly equivalent to code level 4. The intention is if we have a 40% reduction, that no further, in the future thinking work, no further reductions required in CO2 emissions on site to meet a zero carbon policy. If we had 25%, you need an additional step. And my other concern about having, let's say, a 25% step, if you then go to 40%, the sort of technical solutions you're looking for in 25% may not make sense in terms of a 40%. So you might be going in one direction and then having to go in a different direction if you take it in multiple steps. So that's the 25 and 40% target. So how do we express the target? In terms of this, what we've been trying to do is listen to the stakeholder engagement events we've been having over the last year, the 8 events which Francois talked about, and the BRAC meetings, various other events. Currently what happens is we have a historic, the way we set the carbon targets, we have a historic 2002 notional building. We take that notional building, we made an improvement to 20% in 2006, 25% in 2010, and what we do here, if we took the same approach, is have, let's say, a further 40% or 25% on every single dwelling, linking back to that 2002 notional building. But there's some problems with taking that approach further forward. As we're pushing the standard further, we're stretching the standard further, you get disproportionate costs in how easy it is to achieve the target for different types of buildings. So here I show 2 types of buildings. On the left-hand side we have a mid-floor flat. On the right-hand side we have a detached house. A mid-floor flat inherently is a more energy efficient building. It's got less exposed surfaces. Hence, if you look on what we have is 4 different colours there. We have, this is the space heating demand, hot water demand, pumps and fans, and lighting as a percentage over 100% of the energy end use. So what you find there, because a mid-floor flat is more, it conserves energy better, it has relatively less space heating, and therefore it's harder to improve the energy consumption, it's harder to reduce CO2 by including more insulation. It's also harder to reduce carbon from the use of photovoltaics. With photovoltaics, you put them on, let's say, the roof of a building. If you put the roof of an apartment block, you've got to share their benefit through all the apartment units below, whereas if you had it on a house, the benefit applies purely to that house. So it's harder to achieve a carbon target for, let's say, apartments than a detached house. The other issue with taking the traditional approach to carbon setting is it doesn't give anyone a feel of what the carbon solution is. So if I give you a target emission rate of 15, it doesn't give you a feel for what a compliant solution is. And the key feedback we were getting from stakeholder events is we want to have a better understanding of what that carbon target is. Even more than that, people were saying they liked, 10 years ago, the 2002 Part L, there was an elemental solution. People were saying to us they wanted a more elemental compliant solution to Part L. So what we're proposing to do is have exactly that. We're proposing to have an elemental recipe, similar to the approach taken in Scotland at the moment, similar to the approach that was introduced in England and Wales in 2010 for non-domestic buildings, what we're calling an elemental recipe. It's a set of fabric specifications, surface specifications, and we're using PV as a proxy for LZCs. If you achieve that specification, you comply. So it's a very simple elemental route to compliance for Part L. As I said, PV we've used in our recipe as an example for LZCs, but in many cases it may be the most cost-effective practical solution, hence we've used PV. We've suggested PV should be based on the foundation area. There's many different ways in which it could be based, but we've assumed foundation area as something simple to understand and apply in practice. And the difference, we'll go on to, I'll show you the compliant solutions in a second. The only difference between the 40 and 25% solution then is how much PV needs to be installed in the building. So here is the compliant recipe. If you follow this compliant recipe, you meet Part L 2013 for new homes. It's fabric focused. It has it puts stretching fabric, but these are probably similar fabric levels to those you'll be installing to meet Part L 2010 with the additional energy credit. We haven't gone as far as we could have done, let's say, with air tightness and thermal bridging. Particularly our concern was SMEs finding it more challenging to design good air tightness and thermal bridging into their buildings. But it does give people an opportunity, therefore, to improve on air tightness thermal bridging and reduce the amount of PV. And in many cases, it'll be cost effective to do so. The other thing I'd point out about this is the PV, the amount of PV we've put here, it's for certain conditions. So it's for orientation between southwest and southeast, a certain incline, a certain overshading. If you're not in those conditions, you would need to do a SAP calculation and determine how much PV is needed. And this is a recipe. It doesn't mean you need to follow this recipe at all. You can follow any other specification as long as it achieves the same carbon emissions or better. Okay, so we're talking about this as an elemental recipe. This hopefully should particularly help the smaller developers, giving them a compliant solution. A larger developer is likely to have the technical resources to tweak it to best fit with their portfolio and with their cost base. As I said, alternative solutions are allowed as long as it achieves the same carbon performance. And now the challenge is more equitable for different building types. All different building types can achieve Part L 2013 as long as they have the same elemental specifications. And we also call this an aggregate approach. So we're not now talking about a 40% or 25% reduction for every building type, but we've calculated the amount of PV such that over the predicted build mix, it should achieve a 25 or 40% carbon reduction over the build mix. Still need to do a SAP calculation. In some cases, you may choose not to follow the elemental recipe, as said, because your PV may not have the right orientation shading. You may wish to adopt a different solution. You may want to adopt different LZCs, different fabric specifications, different service specifications. So you may want to do a separate calculation. But you also need to do, what we've designed here is a solution to meet the carbon emission target. You still need to do the overheating test in SAP. And as at built stage, you'd also need to do a energy performance certificate. So that's for gas. So what are we thinking about for other fuel types? What we have at the moment in Part L is a fuel factor. The fuel factor gives relief for more carbon-intensive fuel types than gas. So if these other fuel types had to meet the same carbon emissions as gas, they would need much more stringent fabric, much more stringent services, maybe LZCs. So there's a fuel factor that allows some relaxation. Your compliance solution in 2010 has to be harder than gas, but not so hard as if you didn't have a fuel factor. So those situations where, let's say, gas is not available, LPG, oil, etc., or let's say apartment buildings where gas may not be a sensible solution because of safety issues. What we're proposing for 2013 is that the elemental specification will be the same for all fuel types. So if we go back to the elemental specification again, everything will be the same for the different fuel types. The only difference would be, so we have a gas boiler there. Instead of a gas boiler for, let's say, an oil boiler, you have an oil boiler and you have an appropriate efficiency there. For an LPG, same appropriate efficiency. For electric, we've put in a heat pump with a COP, a coefficient of performance, that should give approximately the same carbon emissions as a gas boiler. If you're using biofuels, a low carbon fuel, you achieve all of that, but you don't need to add any additional PV. Okay. All wrong direction. Okay. So, as we said before, this is an aggregate target. Now, not every building needs to achieve 40%. So this is an example based on some building models, some typical buildings models we have of what would the carbon reduction be for different building types. Most of them actually achieve roughly 40%, detached being slightly over 40% on the left-hand side, end terrace was slightly under, mid terrace was pretty well bang on the mark of 40%. But what it does mean for apartments would achieve less than 40%. There's not that many, let's say, apartment buildings being projected to be built, but being built, they will be achieving less than the 40% target because they struggle to achieve the carbon emissions. It's more expensive to achieve the carbon emissions than for other building types. Okay, this also gives an understanding of what it will mean for other fuel types. So on the left-hand side, we've got gas roughly, so we've got 40% there roughly for gas. What we had for oil and LPG previously had to have harder fabric service specifications to meet the carbon target in 2010. By now having the same specifications, actually the relative jump for oil and LPG is less than for gas. On the other hand, for air source heat pumps had the fuel factor. They also had a very high efficiency, and actually in 2010 you could come up with compliant solutions where the fabric was much easier than for a gas heated dwelling. By making everything similar in 2013, actually for air source heat pumps the improvement is actually higher than gas and the other fuel types. Couple of quick things about community heating. I'm not going to go through this graph. If you have a community, let's say you have a gas community heating solution, your gas community heating target will be the same as an individual home gas target. So your carbon targets will be the same. What you'll probably find with a community heating system, your efficiency will be higher, but you'd have distribution losses, and you probably need a little bit more PV, let's say, compared to an individual home solution. Though if you have, let's say, a CHP solution, you're obviously generating electricity, and by doing that, you should need less PV than if you have an individual dwelling, just simple gas boiler solution. So what are the costs? So Francois was talking before about getting involved with the economists, so get involved with the economists who've been working on what's the cost of this policy change. So what we've got there is both the 25% and 40% reduction. What we've estimated there is for different types of dwellings, what's the cost, what's the additional cost compared to the current planning policy for Wales. We've put it in two units. One unit is the pure capital cost, and then we've also put it in pounds per metre squared. And as you can see, there's clearly a greater capital cost for going for 40% reduction. The capital cost is 4,200 compared to 3,300 if we go down 25% option. Also did a second cost, more of a societal and life cycle cost. When we do a societal life cycle cost, it's still a net cost overall, but the net cost across Wales for 25% is 95 million. The net cost of a 40% uprise is less at 49 million, so pretty well half the net cost. And the main reason for the reduction in net cost is the energy saving gains from a higher carbon target, and therefore the savings for the householder on their fuel bills. In the consultation document, there's a series of questions about all the stuff we talked about previously. There's 6 questions. Do you agree with the 40% target? Do you agree with the new aggregate approach to target setting? So you have different targets depending on different building types. Do you agree with the approach for the elemental recipe, a compliant solution? Do you agree with the approach of taking fuel factors rather than separately but integrated into the recipes? Do you believe the elemental recipes are sensible solutions? So if we're going to come up with an elemental recipe, is the fabric, the service and the amount of PV, is that a sensible solution as a recipe? And also some details about how PV should be expressed. So these are all questions to respond to in the consultation questionnaire. So that's a focus on carbon emissions. But in addition to carbon emissions, we need to also try to reduce the energy demand. So we've got an elemental recipe, and if you follow the elemental recipe, you'll also meet the energy demand limits. But if you decide you want to do alternative solutions, we want to avoid people coming up with a solution that would, let's say, be a very glazed greenhouse house with let's say, a biomass boiler. In that case, you're not conserving energy very well, and you're leading to high fuel bills to the householder. So we also want to have an energy limit as well, and there's using the criteria 2 of L1A. So the current approach in Part L is to have limiting fabric standards in the AD to help control heat loss. And we also have service efficiencies in the Domestic Building Services Compliance Guide to help with service efficiencies and other things like insulation of pipework, etc. The current fabric standards and service efficiencies are guidance. They're a reasonable way of reducing the heat losses, a reasonable way of achieving the service efficiencies, but alternative solutions are allowed if building control approves. What we're thinking of doing, what we're proposing to do in the consultation, is have mandatory energy limits now for fabric performance. So whereas in the past they were for guidance only, though most people would adhere to them, we're proposing to change them now into mandatory requirements. Several reasons for this. It's important to focus on these long-lived building fabric. They're going to be in the building for a long time. As Francois talked about, we've got key things to achieve like the Climate Change Act. We don't want to put in fabric now and have to retrofit later. Let's get it right from the start. So let's make sure that those limits are actually installed in the buildings. And there's a concern if we, as we're setting more stretching targets in 2013, and if they're only guidance, they may not be met in practice. Said we want to really get those installed now, avoiding hassle and costly retrofits in the future. So we're proposing to make the fabric parameters mandatory. In England's Zero Carbon Hub, they're proposing a fee standard, which is a performance-based way of setting your energy limits. There is some discussions about changing that in England. It's also a concern, it's a performance standard, so it doesn't give you a understanding about what that means in practice. So if I said you need to achieve a certain amount of kilowatt hours per year per metre squared, that doesn't really give you a feeling for what the solution is. Hence, we prefer to stick with the elemental fabric limiting parameters. So what would they be in 2013? So they've been raised to align with the more stretching carbon emission targets, and we've also looked to align them with standards for existing properties, so whether they're backstops for new build or for existing properties, they're the same numbers, which makes things simpler rather than having lots of different numbers and lots in the different ADs. So in red there you can see the proposed changes for 2013. We're not proposing to change the Building Services Compliance Guide from guidance. So that's still guidance. It's reasonable provision. It's sensible to adopt it. If you do adopt something different, you'd need to get that approved by building control. We propose to use the same compliance guide as for England. At the moment, we don't see any reason why Wales needs a different compliance guide to England, though we're happy to take comments on that as part of the consultation. The changes to the English compliance guide were mainly for clarification and correcting errors in the 2010 guidance, raising standards where practical and cost effective, though in the main there's been very little change in the standards, and also aligning with European directives and standards to be consistent between the compliance guide and the European directives. And again, there's a couple of questions in the consultation, whether you agree with the change from guidance to mandatory fabric, or whether you agree with the changes in the limiting values for fabric and service efficiencies. Other changes to Part L. Criteria 3 focuses on avoiding overheating, so trying to minimise energy consumption to control overheating. In 2010, it very much focused on solar gains, but there's other contributors to overheating, other types of internal heat gains. So much more, with less stress solar gains, more talked about solar gains and other internal heat gains. As an example, I often hear about, let's say, apartment buildings. You can have uninsulated pipe work that can result in heating in communal spaces, which overall leads to overheating. So we've talked a bit more about that in the guidance. Things like insulation of pipe work is actually already in the Building Services Compliance Guide. We've actually brought it also into the AD to make it more prominent. Previously in 2010, in Criteria 4, there was benefit if you followed for thermal bridging, quality assured accredited construction details. It's in the approved document, but it was actually not implemented in practice, so you couldn't get benefits of it. It's been removed from Part L 2013, AD 2013. More discussion on compliance performance will be given by Colin Blick towards the end of the day, and he'll be talking both about domestic and non-domestic and how we take forward compliance performance. Criteria 5. So Criteria 5 is more about giving information to the building occupant. There was information before about you need to give information to the building occupant, but less detail about what needs to be provided. So to help people, we've given more description of what could be provided. We suggest there should be a quick start guide. So like if you bought a television, DVD player, you have a very simple quick start guide. We think that the homeowner similarly should have a quick start guide about their property. So it should talk about the essential design principles and key features of the way you're achieving low carbon, low energy home. Floor plans to show where the controls are for your main heating and ventilation components. Explanation of how to operate, control and maintain your services and LZCs. And also signpost to other information that should be given in a hard copy. So we suggest, in addition to this information, there should also be the appliance manuals, data to calculate the DER and TER, and also the EPC recommendation report. And what we have done in the consultation document is refer to an example quick start guide. So you don't have to adopt that quick start guide, but we're given an example for people to review and people to respond about whether they think that's a good idea or not a good idea. Three more questions. The three final questions we also have in the consultation document is basically any other comments about the approved document. We also provide something called the National Calculation Methodology, which is a much more detailed way of how we're calculating the 25–40% improvements and these elemental recipes. So we give all the detail of that as well. We ask questions about the impact assessment. So Francois talked about impact assessment, which gives the costs and benefits. We ask questions about whether it's fair and reasonable, and whether it fully accounts for all the costs and benefits. So in summary, the main proposed changes are a 40% or 25% reduction in CO2. We're proposing that the target is expressed in a much simpler form to understand and actually implement, incorporating the fuel factors actually within these recipes rather than having separate fuel factors. The limiting energy standards will now be mandatory rather than guidance. We're talking about improving these backstop standards, highlighting the performance of all heat gains in summers and not just solar gains, and we're providing guidance on a quick start guide for homeowners such that they can understand what to do in their new property. And I guess people will be getting a copy of the presentation pack. It just provides details where in the consultation package you can pick up all these details. Thank you.
Okay, you can take questions.
Tom?
I have a question, please.
I think he's not walking off, you're just going to sit there.
Please, yeah.
Richard Price from Home Builders Federation. I'm reading the regulatory impact assessment, and there's a bit of terminology, and I don't quite understand. Well, I understand it, but I don't quite understand the relevance of what it means to the proposals and your decision to opt for a preferred option. It says that both options represent a negative net present value, which means the costs exceed the benefits, if I'm reading that right. So how does that, the result of the regulatory impact assessment, influence your decision to go for the 40% option, considering that it comes out negative?
I thought I did mention this. It's a package of proposals, our preferred option. That's a combination of improvements to new dwellings, that's improvements to existing dwellings, and then the same for the domestic and non-domestic. And I did highlight that, in fact, the bigger gains are to be had in the non-domestic sector. But we're looking at a policy, Richard, of a package. It's not a question of cherry-picking only those. And that's how government policy is developed, and I think that's consistent with the way DCLG in England have done regulatory impact in the past. For climate change, we're going to have to tackle new dwellings, we're talking about housing now, new dwellings and the massive existing stock. You know, and this is a recognition that there are changes needed to all of those. As I say, we now have an EU target for nearly zero energy, and there's no getting out of that. But it is presented as a package. Some of the proposals are less cost effective in net present value than others. But overall, the package of proposals, Welsh ministers were happy and wanted to pursue.
Right, sprinklers isn't included in that RA because it's got its own regulatory impact assessment.
We did the cumulative impact work, and that's in the consultation. That shows you the impact of sprinklers because it was a sort of a concurrent policy under development. When we bring forward the proposals for residential sprinklers, and that work has now started. We're in the process of convening a technical working party, and there was a ministerial statement earlier in the year about the intention and the timetable, the overall timetable for that. That will be supported by a regulatory impact assessment. Now, we've already published a cost-benefit analysis done by BRE, which will be the basis of a regulatory impact assessment. So that will be a separate issue, Richard.
Jonathan Ormond, McCann Partners, Consulting Engineers. You mentioned that for thermal bridging, you'll be using approved construction details. The document actually states a value of 0.9 at the moment, of 0.09.
Yes.
So will the approved construction details actually be expanded on, which we got now, because they are quite limited?
So basically, will we have any new construction details for people to adopt?
We have no work is currently being undertaken on that. I mean, this is the sort of area where we will be working with DCLG over English proposals, because clearly, if there are some details, they may not be quality assured in the same process, but that is something we will look at.
I think what will be useful as part of the consultation response is where you feel there's areas, particularly for Wales, that are lacking, so particularly building types in Wales that are lacking, be useful to get that response, yes.
Mike Leonard from the Modern Masonry Alliance. Take a point, David, about two steps, between 25% if that was the outcome of the consultation, and have to come back to the second step to get to 40%. But we are living in very difficult economic times, and actually economically, from a site viability perspective, that actually might be the right solution. Within that overall package that we talked about, if that was the result of the consultation, that we said, well, actually 25% rather than 40% is a better solution at this stage, does that still fit within your package, or does that change all the dynamics?
Sorry, yeah. I mean, one of the options, the 25%, talks about a review in 2016. Clearly, that's a possibility. What that would introduce then is two steps, because we've got to get to nearly zero energy in any event. And I think I mentioned earlier, certainly when we were talking about with manufacturers about the preference for, in fact, early warning of a final standard. But I mean, it's been put in there as an option. It's not our preferred option, and their further thinking would have to be done. But it does point to a stepped approach. And I don't know how helpful that is. And what we've tried to do is respond to the economic climate in terms of the implementation. These regulations will be made in 2013, but we're talking about January 2015 for the housing element. So we have tried to respond. Clearly, it's a really difficult area, and economists can't really predict where we might be in 2-3 years with the housing market. But it's an option. 25% there is an option. And if there are reasons why you feel that would be beneficial, perhaps from an economic point of view, then we'd like to hear about those in a response.
On that Francois, though, 25% would still be a recipe, it would be aggregate, it would be the same standard for off-gas.
Yeah.
So all the principles are established, aren't they? I think that's the point now.
Yeah, I mean, as Alison said, so whether we go for 25% or 40%, the rest of the presentation would be the same, would just be different amounts of, let's say, PV in our elemental recipe. Okay, I've got existing homes as well. So we focus very much on new homes. I guess more people talk, let's say, about new home standards than existing home standards. So the content of the presentation now is give you a bit of an introduction about existing homes. Then we talk about the changes we're proposing for 2013, improvements to current energy efficiency standards, something called consequential improvements, standards for conservatories and porches, and also way to design flexibility in the ways you actually meet the existing build standards. As I said before, most attention is typically given to new homes. We talk about our zero carbon standards. In this case, we're talking about 40% and 25% improvement. But the main opportunity for saving carbon, reducing energy, is within existing homes. Did some calculations. I looked at Part L 2010. That's okay. Good, thanks. I looked at Part L 2010, and going between 2006 and 2010, we made some improvements for existing buildings. So replacement windows had to be changed from a U value of 2 to a U value of 1.6. Some improvement in boiler efficiency. So some very specific improvements for existing dwellings. Whereas for new homes, we improved carbon emissions by 25% for all new homes, so a big number, 25%. But when you actually look at the energy savings, the carbon savings, you actually notice just these small changes to U value of 2 to 1.6 for existing homes achieves of the order of 5, 6, 7 times as much energy savings than the 25% improvement for all new homes. So the actual big savings we can make are for existing buildings. And so to put this in context, there's about 1.3 existing homes in Wales, and we're talking about at the moment a build rate of between 5,000 to 10,000 per year. As part of the Climate Change Act, what we've got to achieve across the UK is a 80% reduction in carbon emissions by 2050 compared to 1990. And if you actually look at the build mix, so what I have here is buildings from 2010, every 5 years, 2010, 2015, 2020. These are the existing dwellings, existing number of dwellings. Then I've added on at each 5-year interval, the number of new homes. You can see in 2050, when we got to achieve an 80% reduction compared to 1990, that over 80% of dwellings are what we have at the moment. So if we're going to achieve the target, we have to focus on existing dwellings. And if you actually look at what are cost-effective ways of achieving that 80% reduction, they're very similar to the things that we're talking about for Part L. Improving in the fabric insulation, improving the U value of glazing, the sort of things we talk about in Part L. So if we're making changes, doing work to our existing buildings, it seems sensible to try to improve the energy efficiency as well as we can now, rather than waiting for the government to require more expensive retrofits later on. So there's 3 main strategic elements when we're talking about existing buildings in Part L. We think about, can we improve the standards for energy efficiency required when you undertake building works? Can we improve the levels of compliance? So can we actually achieve those energy efficiencies that we're supposed to achieve? And actually, can we bring more building work into scope? Is there any existing building work that's not part of Part L at the moment that we think should be part of Part L, and we can set energy efficiency standards? And these issues actually link to each other. So if we set standards higher, there may be a risk of greater non-compliance, so the capital cost may be higher, but even over the lifetime of the building, there may be energy savings. People may perceive the cost of actually complying with a standard is more expensive. So talking about the different types of energy efficiency standards, first of all talking about the current energy efficiency standards we have in L1A at the moment. We have standards for replacement of control fittings and services. So when we talk about fittings and services, we're typically talking about replacement windows, replacement boilers. So L1B recommends minimum standards when we replace windows, when we replace boilers. And in doing this work for 2013, you could suggest you should have something similar to what we have for new homes, because the energy efficiency is installed in the product. So the energy efficiency of windows is stored in the window, the boilers within the boiler product. So why should it be that different for new homes? One reason maybe it should be different than new homes is if you're building a number of new homes, you can buy things in bulk, and hence you can get more of a cost reduction. But apart from that, taking that into account, why shouldn't it be different than new homes? So we've done some cost-benefit analysis, which we'll take you through in a few minutes about that. Also, similarly for construction extensions, we have energy efficiency standards for extensions, for the thermal elements, for the glazing and for the building services in the extensions. And again, it may be reasonable to say there's limited, there's not many design constraints in building an extension, so why shouldn't they be similar to the standards for new build? Taking account of the fact you're building maybe a single extension and you can buy less in bulk than, let's say, building a number of new homes. And again, we have some cost-benefit analysis. So what we did is we looked at the capital costs and we looked at the energy savings from improving the standards for different elements of a building. What we have here is the external wall. We have the current standard for external wall. So if you have external wall for extension, you should achieve a U value of 0.28. And we've looked at improving the standard and what the impact is. The blue line down here going downwards is the capital cost. Upwards we have the energy savings, and for walls, roofs and floors we talk over 60 years, for windows we talk over 30 years for the asset lifetime. And this is the net. So in this case it shows there's a capital cost, increased capital, there's an energy saving, but overall there is a net benefit. So it's fairly small, but overall there is a net benefit from improving the standards for external walls for an extension. Similar calculation done for roofs, showing again a net benefit. What we do notice for floors is a net cost from moving from where we are at the moment. A small net cost and a bigger net cost in going for windows. These are the proposals we're proposing for 2013. So on the left hand side I have 2010. We're proposing improving the standards for walls, roofs and floors. So even though floors has a net cost in doing so, we feel as a whole we need to improve the energy performance and reduce carbon emissions for the buildings. Windows have a higher net cost, so we're proposing to keep the same standard as in 2010. What I have on the right hand side is what England's proposing for 2013 as well. For walls, roofs and floors the numbers are fairly similar. They've been slightly tweaked for Wales based on talking to the building research establishment about the type of constructions you need to achieve, and 0.21 was seen as more sensible than 0.2 and 0.18 is more sensible than 0.17. But you can see England is pushing windows further than we're proposing to do in Wales. Again, several questions here. You can see the consultation package, questions about these proposed changes. ADA 1B also talks about renovation of thermal elements. So when you have an existing building and you're renovating 50% of the surface or 25% of building envelope, you need to improve the insulation standards. Example, if you're putting on cladding, rendering the external surface or dry lining. We're not proposing to change the standards here from 2010, and that's exactly the proposal in England as well. Anecdotally, this is an area of poor compliance, and our proposal is to get better guidance to people about how to achieve it, rather than changing the standard again when people may not understand and they're certainly not complying with what's been proposed at the moment. The disadvantage about not improving the standard is there clearly are efficiency gains to be made, and we're not taking advantage of that. Hopefully by doing the guidance this time, people better understand and we can improve the standards at some point in the future. Retained thermal element. So we're talking here about, let's say, material change of use. So you change from a warehouse to a flat, or you take an existing element which may become a thermal element as part of a conversion. We set standards for these elements as well. We're not proposing, again, to change the standards. We're talking about having the same standards as renovation. The only thing we're proposing to change, at the moment there's a threshold. There's a threshold that if you're worse than a certain threshold, only then do you need to change to a higher standard. We're suggesting we're going to remove the threshold, that you have to always meet that higher standard. Why we're thinking about doing that is when you're doing material change of use, you're making a big change to your building, you're actually pretty well making a new dwelling, so why should we give a minimum threshold there as well? And it's quite a big thing when you do material change of use, you should have the money there to also improve the fabric of the building as well. Talking to industry, building control, the threshold often isn't considered when looking at conversions. People do build to the standard, they don't look at the threshold limit before building to the improved standard. The other thing is, you only need to undertake the work if technically, functionally and economically feasible. So if there is actually a problem in practice, you don't need to build to the standard, you can build to the best standard that can be practically and cost effectively achieved. Consequential improvements. Consequential improvements are something that's been in ADL 2B since I think 2006. We're proposing to introduce it into ADL 1B in 2013. So what do we have in ADL 2B at the moment? So we have something for buildings greater than 1,000 metres squared. Where you increase the carbon footprint of your building, you should also make allowances to reduce the carbon footprint in other areas. So the triggers we have at the moment for buildings greater than 1,000 metres squared is where you have an extension or increase in habitable area like a conversion, or a provision of a building service, or increasing the capacity of building service. You should also do consequential measures to reduce the carbon emissions as well. When you have extensions, there's a table in ADL 1B of the sort of carbon measures you should be taking, with to be capped at 10% of the building works. If you're doing services, you have to improve the fabric in your service areas, in addition to having this 10% capped list from the table in ADL 2B. We're proposing doing something for dwellings. We're proposing to do something for dwellings that's much simpler than is being done for non-domestic buildings. So for dwellings, for buildings below 1,000 metres squared, we're proposing a simple and low-cost approach. We're proposing triggered only by extensions or conversions, not by installation of building services or increasing capacity of building services, because it's not a common thing for dwellings, and it keeps the approach simpler. We're focusing on improving three parts of the existing dwelling. Minimum standard for loft installation, so where it's below 200 millimetres, it should be increased to 250 millimetres. Where it's appropriate to install cavity wall insulation, and there's more details in the approved document, but minimum standard of hot water cinder insulation. So when you're actually doing extension, when you're doing a conversion, these are additional things that also should be done. That should be able to be done in most cases by the builder carrying out the principal building works. So we feel this is an appropriate and proportionate approach. We're also suggesting that if your extension conversion is below 10 metres squared, so quite small, then you only need to upgrade your loft insulation. So we're trying to be proportionate to the existing building works. So undertaking these works at the same time as other works should reduce hassle, and it's likely at some stage going to 2050 that these homes are going to need these improvements anyway, so it's sensible to be done at the same time. And again, there's a rider in ADL 1B that these changes only need to be made when it's technically, functionally and economically feasible. So it's not a requirement that always needs to be done, it's where it's appropriate to be done. And again, there's a list of questions here all about consequential improvements to get your feedback. Conservatories and porches. Conservatories and porches are currently exempt from the energy efficiency requirements if the area is less than 30 metres squared, if there's adequate thermal separation between the dwelling and the conservatory or porch, and where the heating system in the main dwelling is not extended into the conservatory or porch. There's arguments that actually we should scrap this exemption for conservatories and porches altogether, but we're not proposing to do that in 2013. But what we are proposing to do is, rather than saying where there's no heating system from the dwelling extended to the conservatory, which therefore allows you to put in individual fixed heaters into the conservatory. We're suggesting that it should only be exempt where there is no heating at all in the conservatory, whether it's from the existing building extended or new fixed heaters put into the conservatory or porch itself. So that's what we're proposing. There should be no heating and cooling installed in the conservatory porch at all. The only thing about it is if it has no heating in the conservatory or porch, when a homeowner comes into the building, they could just simply install a portable heater. So is there actually a benefit in saying that there should be no heating in the conservatory or porch altogether? So our concern about conservatory and porches is even if they get unheated, you could put in portable heaters, and many people use them all the year round, and they open up the doors of the conservatory or porch to the rest of the home, so you get the heat movement anyway from the rest of the home, the heat loss into the conservatories and porches. And again, there's a question about the proposed change for conservatories and porches. Finally, in AECOM there is design flexibility, particularly put in there for extensions. So we say with extensions, you don't necessarily have to achieve the U value limits. You can area weight the U value limits such that overall you achieve the U value limits. We also provide a SAP calculation. So if you put an extension to a house, you could, instead of meeting all the requirements for the extensions, energy efficiency requirements, you could actually improve the house itself and reduce the improvements to the extension. So that is that flexibility within AECOM at the moment. It's less clear how that flexibility links to the other changes we've talked about. And what we're proposing is for those design flexibility options to be allowed for all the other existing building works as well. And thank you very much.
Any questions, David? No questions? Right. Yeah. That's a good point, Alison. A show of hands, please, for those of you that actually work with existing buildings. Well, existing dwellings, sorry, yes. Okay, so it's 50-50 in interest there. Well, I think if there are no questions, we're moving now towards lunch. I don't know how we're fixed.
20 minutes early.
We're a little bit early, right. Okay, and the SAP session is starting at 1:05. I mean, are there any more general questions on what you've seen so far, or what you've heard so far? Sure.
What is there's no definition in the proposed L1A. What is the definition of foundation area?
Yeah, we've just taken out basically your ground floor area.
The footprint of the building.
The reason for that is
the footprint of the conditioned space or the footprint of the building.
Footprint of the building. If the reason was for situations where you had a house with an integral garage, then that roof area of the garage would be included in the percentage proportion. When we looked towards the sensible amount of photovoltaics that might be installed in the building, it was based on the available roof area. So foundation area was taken as a measure to include that situation, and also for apartments where you actually have circulation spaces and non-conditioned spaces on the ground floor to give you a better measure of your available roof area. In more detail.
Right, okay, that's a good point.
Hi, Andrew Searle, Red Homes. I'm not involved with the existing housing stock, but from what I've heard, I can see how carbon emissions from existing housing stock will be reduced by your proposal unless the extension is a far smaller proportion than the size of the existing building that you're adding the insulation to.
So missing that?
Yeah, I don't, sorry, I'm following.
Well, you're saying you're looking for the carbon reductions. We're looking for overall carbon reduction. Yes?
Yes.
But it's only being applied to houses that are increasing their carbon footprint by adding the additional dwelling space.
As opposed to what? Houses generally?
Yes. So you're not looking to apply this to houses that are not applying for conservatories or extensions.
Right. I think the point here is that building regulations work needs to be happening.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you know, there's limits to when the building regulations can kick in. Are you talking about requirements for existing housings to upgrade generally?
I'm just trying to understand where the reductions, how you would generate the reductions. We're trying to look for reductions in the carbon footprint or carbon emissions.
Right, but I think what you're saying, what, are you talking about the consequential improvements where some work is being done to that house?
No, I'm saying...
Or you're thinking generally about...
I said generally that,
right,
that you had 80% of the housing stock was the existing stock, and you're trying to implement the improvements by way of applying it to those homes that apply for extensions or conservatories.
Well, in some ways, the building regulations is a limited tool. And as I said, building regulations type of work has to be happening for us to be able to require something. When we're looking at the existing stock, there's a range of policies and activities that are aimed, as you quite rightly point out, at reducing emissions in the existing stock. So, for example, in Wales we have grant programmes. We have what's called the NEST programme and the RBED programmes that are about improving stock. In the social housing sector, we have expectations on social landlords to improve their stock. Government over in London is inventing the Green Deal. That's another tool that will be aimed at encouraging. When you talk about regulations, you know, we're constrained by the Building Act, and something has to be happening for the building regulations for us to get our foot in the door, if you want. But it's a complicated area. And building regulations is but one of those policy tools by which we can improve. And what we hope we're doing is taking the opportunities. So.
Good afternoon. Peter Zepman from Forest Glass. My question is directly about Part L introduction in 2013. You mentioned in the various talk that your proposals for new domestic, you've done the cost analysis on existing domestic, and the argument tends to be that the standards should be the same. Yes. But you also dropped in there on windows that in England windows were going down to 1.4 from 2013, but in Wales you weren't proposing to do that in the proposals that were going to be left as it is at 1.6.
Yes.
Bearing in mind that in Wales we produce windows for the rest of the country, and that virtually all the industry based in Wales sells to the rest of the UK, I find it rather odd that we should end up having a difference. I can't see the logic in why you wouldn't follow, even if there is a reason why 1.6 is a sensible stop place. If England is going to 1.4, it seems illogical not to go there too.
It's a good point you've made. I mean, David, I think our view was informed by the various engagement activities, but also discussions with manufacturers, and some of them local manufacturers, and that's what informed our proposal. Very interested in hearing views from manufacturers on the cross-border issue. I mean, we've had a lot of discussion with house builders about cross-border issues, but what might happen is that irrespective of what target Wales sets, the larger England market might actually determine that window performance in Wales is better than is required by the building regulations. But that's something that, I mean, you know, I'd encourage you to put in your consultation response, and we will revisit. I mean, we did have a number of discussions with window manufacturers in Wales about what was practical as the next step, and that informed our thinking. But I take your point.
Okay. Thank you. Michael Benfield, Timber Frame. General question, but related to the existing stock market. What sort of, has any work been done, or are there any projections as to the rate of demolition of existing stock and the potential rate of improvement for that existing stock, and the period over which you would expect improved houses then to remain in the existing stock? This is relevant to the overall reduction that you're...
I mean, we have general assessments on the on the rate of replacement, you know, and rather small percentages are often...
If we've got a stock of 1.3 million houses,
yeah,
at what rate are we expecting those to be totally replaced or demolished?
Right. I mean,
it's a good point, and it should be considered in the impact assessment. My understanding is it's a small part of the impact assessment, so it's not a major part of the overall cost of benefits.
But this relates to the question before last, which is the overall reduction or the overall improvements that you're going to be able to obtain if you're not satisfactorily addressing the whole of the existing stock. If you're going to rely upon merely improvements or extensions to existing houses going forward, then you also need to know what that rate should be.
And the regulatory impact assessment does include assessments of the rate of extensions, and I think David gave a slide earlier which showed the proportion of the stock that would be existing in 2050 against now, and certainly BRE have presented that, and it, you know, the new addition, if you want, from now to 2050 varies between 20% and a third. But we have made assessments of the rate of improvement, and they've featured in the regulatory impact assessment.
Anne Sharp from the Energy Saving Trust. Just wanted to ask about the removal of the boiler fitting as part of the... what the thinking was behind removing the boiler replacement as part of the triggers. If I've understood.
Yeah, it wasn't boiler replacement, it was the installation of a new... It's not a replacement, it's installation of a new service. So it's like if a home didn't have a type of building service at the moment, if you installed a new type of building service.
If you do any works to the existing.
And replacement of a boiler is not a trigger. No. And it was never a trigger for non-domestic. It was a proposal for England. It's never in non-domestic originally.
This was fun. David Jones from Green Solutions. Why did you pick PV solar instead of PV hot water systems?
Solar thermal has a maximum proportion of the hot water load that it can provide, and so there's a finite maximum carbon saving you can get from it. Whereas solar PV, your limit is on your available roof area, or southeast, southwest facing available roof area, which is a higher limit of carbon savings. Solar thermal with a range of fabric measures might get you to a 25% saving, but on its own it wouldn't, in addition to the notional spec So PV was just taken as a proxy for renewable electricity generation. There's a general, most of the building regs works on reductions to heat in the dwelling. There's a greater issue with electricity, and there's greater potential with low carbon electricity to carbon savings. But I mean, photovoltaics was taken as a proxy for renewable electricity generation. It just seems to be the most likely one.
Both technologies are very inefficient. That's why the government's subsidising them with the feed-in tariff and the RHI. If you're talking about sustainability and carbon reduction, if you look at the roof areas, then the solar heating is 4 to 5 times per square metre more effective to produce the same kilowatt hours, right?
In kilowatt hours, yes, but in carbon it's broadly comparable. So in kilowatt hours of heat, yes, in terms of if your electricity generated in power stations is 2.4, 2.5% times less efficient.
So you're really basing it on the replacement of the electricity from the generating position?
Yes.
Not on sustainability?
Yes, on sustainability in terms of carbon emissions.
I mean, it has to be said, this was a proxy for our modelling of the most likely technologies that will be available. You know, you're not constrained to that for an individual building.
No, it doesn't make sense really, because there's more houses that can put a solar panel on for heating or hot water than there is for PV. I mean, it's 4 times the area.
I mean, if you want to put solar hot water on, there's nothing stopping you at all. We have to come up with a proxy, whether it's solar hot water, whether it's PV. We'll come up with PV, but you're flexible in what you put on your building.
And this wasn't an original thought. I mean, this built on the work of the UK Zero Carbon Hub when it was doing modelling on carbon compliance and their fabric efficiency standard. If it was chosen as the most likely technology, and solar heating is a one-hit affair really. It's
And just one final note. I mean, no one's mentioned to shut off these expensive lights when we don't need them. So I mean, we've all got to improve our knowledge.
I've got a torch.
Thank you. If we accept existing stock as being the holy grail really, because new build rates in Wales are not going to save the planet at the moment. So we have to deal with that. 2 things occur to me. One, how are we going to measure the effects? How are we going to record who's done what, where they've done it, and how that contributes to the target? And secondly, how are we going to control? You mentioned that there's a massive disconnect in England between DCLG and debt, for instance, and with the Green Deal coming in and AECOM funding coming into the mix in October, we're going to see lots of houses clad by inefficient and unskilled labour and all sorts of ventilation issues which impact on building regulations and quality of air and quality of living standards. So I wonder how we're going to deal with those 2 issues.
Okay, firstly, I mean, through the approval and compliance building control system, we'll have the data on where work has been undertaken and the sort of work that's been undertaken, and that will then inform calculations that are done on annual emissions and all the rest of it. On the relationship that the Welsh Government has with UK government departments, we do coordinate and work with them. So colleagues of mine are engaged with DEC over the development of the Green Deal, and what is being proposed there is a fairly comprehensive package in terms of skills development, certification and the rest of it. We don't actually link our building regulations proposals to Green Deal. We point to it as a potential source of funding and potentially, David mentioned technical, economically feasible. A Green Deal assessment might be a support in an argument over that. And the Welsh Government is interested in the Green Deal, if only from an economic perspective, to make sure that Welsh installers got the necessary certifications to get work from it. How it takes off, we'll have to see. You are right. I mean, there's a whole host of different things going on. And what we're interested in, what we're increasingly going to be interested in the future, is what are the actual consequences of that in terms of performance. Because we can go inventing regulations all day long, and Colin will talk a bit about compliance, but you know, in the new build sector, you know, there was a recommendation from the UK hub that whatever standards are set for zero carbon, you know, those should be actual performance rather than theory. There's a lot of work that's still to be done on that. If you look at the Green Deal assumptions that DEC are using, you'll see derating of what they think, you know, loft insulation and cavity insulation will actually prove, and they've built that in. There's a whole pile of work to be done on getting a better understanding of actual performance.
Yeah, my main point was that and it probably come in compliance, but a lot of this work that goes on isn't covered by building control anyway, or by building regulations. You've got competent person schemes, but you've also got a lot of loft insulation, all things being put into people's homes. I've no idea how that's really recorded, and you know, because it's certainly not going to be recorded through building control, for a planning application or anything, is it?
Well, no, I think you find that most of it is being recorded. The bulk of loft insulation work would be dealt with through competent persons arrangements. The bulk of the activity is currently, before the Green Deal, is generated by the utility companies with their cert obligations, and they will be feeding that information through. You know, if there's a black market, you know, clearly that's another issue. But I think most of the work done on existing building improvement is being captured. I mean, if you can, again, appreciate any concerns you've got. If there's an example of a situation where we'll look at that, and that, you know, that any real gaps would need to be addressed.
Thanks. Francois, just picking up on the PV. I see the equation in one of your consultation documents on how much PV you need. Can you give us an idea of what percentage of the roof area that would mean for a semi or a detached?
Yeah, for a semi-detached house, it's about 25% of your roof area. So for the 40% target.
So 40% target, 25% of roof area.
For a detached?
That was for, well, it would be for any house, yeah.
Oh.
Because it's...
How many panels is that, roughly?
It was about on the semi we tested, it was 1.4 kilowatt peak, so about 7 panels, 6-7 panels, something like that.
And have you looked at that in terms of the design of housing sites?
So they've
got to face a certain way in it.
I mean, that came from, there was work done when the Zero Carbon Hub were looking at practical limits. Richard Partington Architects did a whole piece of work looking at what were the upper limits, which were more like 40%. But I think the hub took a reduced value on that down to about 30%, and that was taking into account changes in orientation and dormers as well. So no, we didn't do more work looking at exact roof layouts for this study, but it was considered that was conservative enough that it wasn't a concern.
I mean, if there are issues, Richard, over Welsh sites that you think might cause that to be reduced, then we're interested in hearing about them.